Can microorganisms actually hear sounds? We're going to talk all about this and so much more on today's episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. I, as always, am your host, Dr. K, and I'm here to guide you through yet another story chronicling the lives of the tiny and the infamous, and that is, of course, the incredible and the amazing bacteria and all such related microorganisms, including one of the organisms we're going to talk about today, a small fungus. We'll talk about its name and what it does in a minute. Before we get into that, though, first, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button if you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, or if you're listening to this podcast on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts or something like that. Don't forget to give us a follow. It helps support the channel, and it helps to support the podcast as well. Now, let us jump into the actual science. So this is actually a really cool question, really cool study that came out in October 2024. We'll talk about that study specifically in a minute. But first, I want to kind of lay the context for this study and just what their overall question was. In order to understand this, we need to talk a little bit about how cells and how organisms respond and react to their environment. Because it turns out cells and organisms, in order to maintain homeostasis, in order to essentially stay alive, they have to be able to respond to their environment. They have to be able to sense their environment and then respond to their environment. And cells and organisms do this in a whole bunch of different ways. Obviously, human cells and human organisms, we do it all the time. We are able to pick up environmental cues and then respond to those just as a total organism. But our individual cells are also going to do the same thing. So, for example, a human cell, it'll sense and respond to the presence or absence of a given hormone, like adrenaline or, insulin or something like this. It'll also respond to the presence or absence of like a chemical gradient or an electrical gradient, a key component of how we do just brain signaling and neuron-based signaling is based off of these chemical and electrical gradients. So our human individual cells and the entire human organism is able to sense and respond to the environment. But we're obviously not the only organism in the world. There's other organisms out there, and those organisms also have to sense and respond to their environment as well. One really cool, famous example would be the tropisms. So tropism, that's basically changing the way in which you're growing or orienting yourself to some kind of environmental cue. Now, we typically see this in plants. There's tons and tons of instances of these tropisms in plants. They include something like aerotropism, which is where you're either growing in the direction of the wind or you're growing in the opposite direction of the wind. Maybe you can even see this now in nature. There's hydrotropism. This is when you're growing towards water. So if you have a plant and you stick that bad boy into the soil and then you have water running on one side of the plant and not on the other side of the plant, typically what will happen is those root structures will sense the presence of the water in the soil and then grow towards that water. So that's hydrotropism. There's also thigmotropism. This one's kind of an odd one. This is when plants are responding to touch. So an example of this would be like, so we're growing plants. An example would be like a pea plant. So if you take a pea plant and then put it next to like a metallic structure, the pea plant's going to shoot out these little arms, and those will it'll sense the presence of those metal structures and then grow up along the side of the metal structure. But it'll do that by physically holding on to and touching that metallic structure. So that's thigmotropism, responding to touch. One of the most famous of these is what's called gravitotropism. So this is when you're growing in a particular direction in response to gravity. The way this is typically done is that plants will grow in the opposite direction of gravity. There's this really cool, hang on, let me bring this up. I had it a second ago. There's this really cool example in Italy where, and if you Google this, you can find this. So if you just Google Roman villa, Villa, gravitotropism, right, you're going to see this really odd picture of a tree that looks like it's kind of like a cave of some sort, but it's totally upside down. It's growing out of the top part of the cave, growing directly down. But then if you zoom in on it, you'll see that the individual buds at the peripheries of the plant, they're turning back upwards. They're going back up against gravity, even though the entire plant is totally flipped on its head. Right? So this is really cool. These are some really neat examples of how different organisms and individual cells, especially human and plant cells, are able to sense their environment and then respond to their environment. Now, obviously, we on this podcast enjoy talking about unicellular organisms, for example, such as bacteria and fungus. So do unicellular organisms, do they also respond to their environment? And they're all, again, we've talked a little bit on the podcast about some really, really cool examples of how unicellular organisms respond to the environment. We talked about quorum sensing before. So quorum sensing, if you recall, this is how bacteria are able to coordinate group behavior. And the way they do that is by sensing the amount of their brothers and sisters that are present in a localized environment. So a bacteria can sense, for example, if there's 10 bacteria present, then it'll be like, okay, there's not enough for us to do an activity. But if there's 10 trillion of us present, then like, oh, okay, there's plenty for us to do whatever activity. So then this is a way that bacteria are able to coordinate group behavior as a way of maximizing their impact. So that's quorum sensing. And there's plenty of other instances of unicellular organisms sensing and responding to their environment as well. But just as there are odd instances of how larger organisms, like the gravitotropism, like we talked about a second ago, how larger organisms respond to the environment, there are also some odd ways that unicellular organisms will respond to their environment as well. Now, in particular, let's focus a little bit on sound, and indeed, that's what the folks in this paper were. I mentioned it's not ancient in terms of science time, but it's October 2024. That's relatively long time ago, so I apologize if we haven't addressed this in some time. But anyway, there's a whole group of scientists out of Flinders University, that would be in Australia, and what they're doing is they were looking specifically at a plant growth-promoting fungus called Trichoderma harzianum. Trichoderma harzianum. And this is, as I mentioned, it's a fungus that's involved in, it promotes plant growth. So it's a healthy fungus that promotes the ability of a plant to continue growing. Now, for whatever reason, these folks over at Flinders University, whatever they do in Australia, this is, I don't know what their rationale was, but they said to themselves, well, G researchers over here at Flinders University in Australia, let's see if the growth of this fungus changes in the presence of some kind of sound. So what they did is they took these fungi and they put them on these little plates, and then they put them in these little boxes and then turned on a Bluetooth speaker, just a normal Bluetooth speaker, and all it was doing was playing this monotone acoustic sound. The way that they described it, it's almost like the sound of radio static. So as you go from one station to another station, well, hang on, maybe I should probably explain what a radio is for the younger members of my audience. No, I'm sure you'll figure it out. So there's as you go from one station to another station on the radio, there's a little radio static sound. So that's the sound essentially that they were playing. Now, what's really, really interesting is that when T. harzianum was grown in the presence of this radiostatic white noise-ish sound, right, this actually led to a more rapid growth of the fungus. In the presence of the sound, it grew faster than just a normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill T. harzianum, right? So this white noise was promoting the growth of this fungus. Now, this is really, really wild and really, really cool, but it's actually not the first time that we've seen something like this and seen unicellular organisms respond to the presence or absence of some kind of sound. So as it turns out, E. coli bacteria also grow better when they're exposed to, would you believe this, the sound of refrigerators. Okay, so E. coli grows better in the presence of refrigerator sounds. That's very, very neat. Another group back in 2021, they found that the bacteria that produce some of the flavor compounds that you get in wine, so extremely important bacteria, they grew better, they were healthier, they had more rapid proliferation when they listened to, and I'm not making this up, when they listened to classical, mainly Baroque music. So they took these bacteria, put them in the presence of primarily Baroque music, and then exposed them to that for the duration of an entire growing season, and it helped with the growth and the proliferation of this bacteria. So there's a whole bunch of different things in theory that you could do with this, obviously, right? If you could control it, obviously, since microorganisms are tightly linked with the health of a larger organism, like a plant or a human, right? Then if you can control the growth of bacteria or fungus using some of these sounds or even the sound of music, right, then there's ways that you could cultivate a microbiome and make it even healthier by listening to certain types of sounds or exposing yourself to certain types of sounds. That's the general applicability that we're talking about here. Now, a deeper question is why on earth is this actually happening? Now, we're still obviously figuring this out. It's a relatively new phenomenon, at least as far as I can tell. But there are some cool ideas. Obviously, as much as it's kind of cool to think about, these tiny little guys, they don't actually have ears, right? So that's not the way that they're actually responding to the environmental cue, but that's also not the only way that an organism or anything at all can respond to sound. You don't need ears in order to respond to sound. Obviously, sound waves are waves, right? And those individual waves will exert pressure. This is the hypothesis then, exert pressure on the cell membranes of these organisms. Now, once we look at it in that context, cells actually have ways that they're able to interact with pressure. There's these proteins that that you have on the exterior of these membranes called mechanoreceptors, and these mechanoreceptors will sense and then respond to different kinds of pressure. Right? Now, the hypothesis then is that it's possible that these organisms then have evolved mechanoreceptors that respond to waves of a certain frequency and a certain type of intensity. Right? Now, why they've done this is anybody's guess at all. But first of all, it's so cool, right? The general idea then that these kind of act like little ears for the tiny little organisms, and that it's these receptors that are allowing these tiny organisms to sense and respond to these auditory cues. Now, let's recap, and then we'll get out of here for today. The first point that we talked about was that different types of cells will respond to environmental cues. We talked about human cells, and also whole organisms will respond to environmental cues. Obviously, we respond to environmental cues, and then the plants, we gave that famous example of gravitotropism in the plants in that little tree. You should definitely look that up. It's pretty crazy. So that's the first point. The second point is that researchers around the world, and in particular we highlighted the one in Flinders University, we're curious to see how sound, in particular, was it influencing unicellular organisms. And they looked at fungus, but we've also looked at this in terms of bacteria as well. Our third point was that by using a whole bunch of different sound types, and these ranged from white noise, like at Flinders, all the way to Baroque music, right? Researchers were able to demonstrate a way that they could alter the growth rate of certain types of microorganisms. Right, and the theory, or what we could do then is we can utilize these sound waves as a way of cultivating healthier microbiomes, or cultivating healthier microflora and microfauna. Now, point number 4, our final point, a current hypothesis about how this occurs is that sound waves are going to exert pressure on the membranes of these organisms, and that's the thing that's actually cueing the change in the behavior. It's a really, really cool theory. Obviously, I'll keep you guys in the loop whenever I learn more about how these different kinds of microorganisms are sensing and responding to these different auditory cues. It'd be really, really cool. I mean, I'm sure you guys have heard of the different studies like, oh, what happens if they grow in the presence of rock and roll, or in the presence of classical, or in the presence of just beautiful choral music, right? So I'm sure there's plenty of different experiments that we can run with different kinds of bacteria from here on out. But it is really, really cool, the concept that having a specific kind of music or a specific kind of sound can alter the composition of one's microbiome. But anyway, we're going to leave that there for today. I want to say thank you to each and every single one of you guys who tuned in for today, and I will talk to you guys again next time on another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria.